have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Remembering the March on Washington and racial progress in the 50 years since then. It's Arizona Week.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chihak.
Commemorations are underway of Martin Luther King's history-making I Have a Dream speech 50 years ago. We measure racial progress and look at event plans. First, an Arizonan who was at the March on Washington in 1963.
I'm Luther Holland. I'm an ordained clergy person, having been ordained in the United Church of Christ some 43 years ago, and prior to ordination for 10 years was striving to become an ordained member of the clergy. I became involved with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the middle-of-the-road conservative at the time organization that had a lot of history in the black community. And as a youngster, I got elected to be president of the Jamaica branch, Jamaica, New York City branch of the NAACP Youth and Young Adult Division. That got me to Washington, D.C. in 1963 for the March on Washington. We had about 10 buses that left our branch from Jamaica, New York to go to Washington, D.C. I think we left between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning and took a 6-hour trip. We stopped for a brief breakfast, snack, and then went into D.C. And I didn't realize the reason we stopped outside of D.C. And the reason we stopped outside of D.C. is, had we stopped in D.C., we would have to eat in an establishment that would accept Negroes or black people. In 1963, there was no fair housing accommodations for black people, nor was there places to eat, places to go to the bathroom, unless it was for colored people only. Places to drink water from a water fountain. There were white water fountains and black water fountains. That's just 50 years ago in this country. When I arrived and when our buses unloaded, I was fortunate to be escorted as far up front as I could get. And so I was about 50 to 100 feet away from the platform, the dais, in which people were to speak and to sing. And my 50-year memory of this event was listening to Marian Anderson, who was one of the first African Americans, first black person to sing with the Metropolitan Opera of New York. The singer that I remember is Mahalia Jackson, a black gospel singer out of Chicago, Illinois. She sang a black spiritual, "I've been buked and I've been scorned." And the words go something like, "And I've been talked about sure as you are born." And it was at that point that tears began to flow from my eyes because it became personal. And I looked around and I didn't know a soul that was standing next to me, but their eyes were welled up also and tears were flowing. And these were white, black, brown people. And we began to embrace. And then there was a Jewish rabbi that spoke. And then A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Sleeping Car Porters of America, a black union, stood up to introduce Dr. King. But what stuck in my mind and still sticks there is his final words were, "Let me present to you the moral voice of America, of our nation. And then the crowd went wild. Dr. King stood up, came to the microphone, and began his speech. I use the word speech because it was written out, and usually when something is written out, it's a speech. He spent lots of time writing it. He was in Detroit the week before and in Chicago, and he used phrases from what he was writing as a backdrop to the March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech. But there were several times he left his text, left the printed word, and began to preach. It was the last time when he got to the point of, my country 'tis of thee, and then he started talking about the dream. And Mahalia Jackson is sitting there, and she begins to shout to this black Baptist preacher, preach, pastor, tell them about the dream, tell them about the dream. She must have said it 3 times. And by the time she finished, Martin King's voice had gone up 2 octaves, and his hands started moving, and you could see that he thought he was at a Baptist church pulpit and that he was in church. Well, the surroundings looked like church, because I looked around at the end of the March on Washington, and we were all dressed in shirts and ties, suit jackets, sports coats. Women had on dresses, women had on pillbox hats, and the black women had on white gloves. It was as though they were at a formal church service, and it ended that way. And then after Dr. King spoke, and after he preached about having this dream, instead of saying amen or closing with a benedictory prayer, he just moves away from the microphone and sits down. I'll never forget that. It was a great day. It's a day I'll never forget. And Dr. King gave us a roadmap in his litany of things that he thought America needed to accomplish. When I realized what was going on, there were 2 points. The first one was after Mahalia sang the I've Been Buked spiritual, and people began to cry, at least around me, and we began to hug. And then I could look out and see, where did all these people come from? And we came, and we heard a dreamer dream, and we all agreed with the dream and the dreamer. And we left that place committed, at least I did. So I figured if I did, others did also. We left that place committed to help change America.
Our state has its own history of racism and racial progress. Arizona State University professor Matthew Whitaker directs the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Here's what he told me. You've researched Arizona's racial history. Can you tell me, is it distinct from the way history has unfolded as far as race is concerned in other places?
In some ways it's distinct, but by and large it's very similar. There are nuances because of the region that we were in, because of the demographic population in Arizona. So African Americans, for instance, have never been more than 8 or 9% of the population. I think at the highest it was 11% in a certain county. So African Americans in this state have always had to interact with and collaborate with other people of color and other whites, like-minded individuals, to fight for civil rights. So as opposed to, say, Selma or Birmingham, Arizona, civil rights has never been just a black-white issue. It's been a very diverse coalition that's fought for civil rights here.
And what kinds of things has that brought to the fore in terms of interaction with the policymakers, interaction with those who may not want racial and ethnic minorities to get ahead?
Well, I think it's actually, what happened in Arizona is instructive, because the powers that be really had to fight a war on multiple fronts. You know, they had to deal with the indigenous issues. They had to deal with Latinos who were fighting for their rights. They had to deal with, obviously, new immigrants, whether that be Greeks or Jewish Americans coming here. And so they weren't able to deflect from the issue of racial intolerance by pointing to someone else. You had multiple groups that were here that were saying, hey, we're being discriminated against. So that changed the dynamic a little bit here, and it actually hastened some wonderful changes in the laws in Arizona in advance of changes at the national level.
Dr. King came to Phoenix back in the 60s to speak, and when I talked to you in advance of our interview, I said that's even though Arizona had then and still has a very small African American population. But you said that's not the consideration here.
No, not at all, because the people who brought him here were a very diverse group of folks. So he was brought here by what was called the Phoenix Forum. It was led by Herbert Eli, who's a Jewish attorney in town. He was the head of the ACLU, I believe, at the time. I think he was the chief legal counsel for the NAACP. There was a number of other groups that were very interracial in nature. And so they wanted to bring him here to talk about justice and to talk about equality and to talk about access to public accommodations and brotherhood and sisterhood.
And what were the results of that visit specifically in Arizona? Are they measurable?
I believe that they are in a number of ways. He came to Tanner AME Church, which is the oldest predominantly African American church in the state, but it wasn't just African Americans that were there that day when he came to the church to speak. And he came to speak about jobs and tangible things that brought about equality in the United States. He wasn't just coming to talk about dreaming. He's coming to talk about dealing with the poor, whether that's the white poor, dealing with treating your neighbor poorly and treating them better if they were Latinos or what have you. And so there were a number of people that were here. What it engendered ultimately was the creation of a Human Relations Commission here in Phoenix. That became, there was a state commission that was developed afterwards. And we also passed a public accommodations law in Arizona just before the accommodations, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I should say, that dealt with public accommodations at the national level. Now, King can't be credited with all of that. The local community, the local activists all over the state were fighting for that. But he was able to come in and bring a measure of legitimacy, of rhetorical brilliance, and camaraderie at the national level to help with that extra push.
Has that kind of progress continued over the last half century in recent times?
It has and it hasn't. We've been moving forward counterclockwise in many ways. So there have been lots of symbolic victories that some of the legal changes have engendered. So folks can legally go wherever they want to go. Folks can legally attend schools that are, at least on paper, desegregated, but we know that many schools in America and in Arizona are more segregated now than they were in 1968, and that's because of economic realities, right, and social realities that endure. So King and that particular generation did what they had to do by changing most of the laws, but laws don't necessarily engender changes of attitude, and laws certainly don't, unless the laws are written specifically to do this, change the economic environment that engenders racial, economic, and gendered inequality in our society. Those things are still there.
So are we still dreaming Dr. King's dream? Are we fulfilling Dr. King's dream slowly?
I believe it's a process. It is a process. I always like to say Malcolm X, who many people falsely sort of align with King as his nemesis. That's sort of a false dichotomy. But Malcolm X once said that if you stab a person in the back with a 9-inch knife and pull it out 6 inches, is that progress? He asked the question. And so I would simply say that the knife has been pulled out. I don't know how many inches, but before we can start talking about real progress, you have to pull the knife all the way out. You have to suture the wound, and it has to begin to heal. The wound is still there. The wound of economic inequality is still there. Of gender inequality is still there. Racial inequality is still there. So yes, I think we're making progress, but we have a long way to go.
In Tucson, a march is planned for Wednesday, marking the anniversary, and other events have been underway for several weeks. Here to talk about it and about racial progress are Pastor Elwood McDowell of Trinity Missionary Baptist Church, Phil Lopez, a former State House Minority Leader who was at the original March on Washington, and Thomas Martin, President of the Black Student Union at the University of Arizona. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Mr. Martin, tell us about some of the activities that are underway and planned in connection with the 50th anniversary.
Well, coming up, we have a church service planned on Sunday at 6 o'clock, I believe, 6 o'clock. But previously, we had several community forums on social justice, education, and healthcare.
And good attendance at those?
Yes, good attendance at those.
And where is the church service on Sunday?
The church service, well, actually, Mr. McDowell.
Mount Calvary.
At Mount Calvary
Missionary Baptist.
Okay, we'll put that information on our website.
Okay.
And then there's a march on Wednesday commemorating, that's the day of the anniversary, right?
Yes, on Wednesday, we have a march commemorating the actual March on Washington.
And Mr. Lopez, how do these activities foster the vision that Martin Luther King put forward 50 years ago?
Well, I think the vision is still to be to materialize. So I think what these events do, it highlights how far we still have to go on the issues that Martin Luther King stood for.
And you were at the march in Washington, so
I
you
was.
actually witnessed this history, correct?
I was there purely by accident because I had just come home in July from being a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years in Colombia, and I was in Washington, and I knew nothing about what was going on, so I just said, well, I want to go see what this is, and one of the things that I'll never forget is I got in the march, and I found myself amongst a large group of women, most of whom were African American, and they had these hats on that said ILGWU, and I said, well, what does that mean? International Ladies Garment Workers Union, one of the largest unions in the country. We had a great time in the march just talking.
And Reverend McDowell, Mr. Lopez referred to the need to make more progress. Are we making progress?
Well, we've got quite a long ways to go. Right here in Arizona, some figures I heard a few years ago regarding incarceration. 13.7% of the prison population at that time were African American males, and we are only 4.5% of the state population. The dropout rate in high schools is still inordinately high for African American children. I don't know the exact figures right now. We have other problems in regards to job discrimination that come up all the time, the way people are treated at times. And, we are just concerned about all of those problems, and then there are many more. I won't go into all of them today.
Let's talk about one area of progress, Mr. Martin. You're a college student, and at the time of the March on Washington in '63, about 4% of African Americans had gone to college and graduated. Now it's about 21%, and you're about to join those ranks in the next year or two,
Yes.
assuming your studies continue to go well.
Yes.
Is that a sign of progress?
It's definitely a sign of progress, but like Pastor McDowell said, we still have a long way to go. Like, for example, here at the University of Arizona, a school of about 40,000 people, I believe there are only about 1,200 African-American students, including grad students. So we have about 1,000 undergraduate students, which is not a lot of people in a school of 40,000 people. And I think that's a trend that's continued nationwide in universities across.
And Mr. Lopez, part of the way of making progress is to continue to talk about these issues. A lot of people in society don't like to talk about some of these issues because it's uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. What do you say to that? Do we need that dialogue, and how do we keep it going?
Well, I think the dialogue is absolutely necessary, but I'm dubious about efforts to create dialogue, bring people together for the purpose of doing this. I guess what I would prefer is having more African Americans in the workplace. I remember when we first started Pima College, one of the new faculty members came up to me after the first faculty meeting, and he had been born and raised in Tucson. He said, "I've never seen so many black people in my entire life." We did that at Pima because the focus was on recruiting African Americans. So I think doing that sort of thing and having more people interact, not in hypothetical situations, but work situations, church situations, social situations. I think that's more preferable than trying to create meetings where we talk about civility and that sort of thing, in my opinion.
And Reverend McDowell, in just about a half a minute remaining, can we draw a line from 1963 Martin Luther King's speech to today when we have an African American president?
Oh, I would definitely say yes. Not only was Martin so important in that, but people like Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others who were active and involved in the struggle made the difference in terms of where we are now. It's just that we're in a situation where, as fine a president as we have, to me, it's risky for him still to say anything in support of African Americans in this country. It's politically risky, and I appreciate his willingness to say something about Trayvon Martin affair.
Reverend Elwood McDowell, Thomas Martin, Phil Lopez, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next generation of societal leaders has a bead on racial and gender progress. We spoke with 2 college students for their views. We're speaking today with Corey Hardy, a PhD candidate in Women and Gender Studies at Arizona State University, and Sylvia Whitley, a senior in communications at Arizona State. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having us.
Ms. Whitley, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke 50 years ago about having a dream. From that, what dream do you have?
My dream, honestly, it kind of fall in line with Dr. King's dream as well. I would like equality across the board. I would like the same job opportunities as my male counterparts have, as my white sisters have. I want the same opportunities and just to be able to fulfill myself as an American.
And Ms. Hardy, same question. What is your dream in relation to the way Dr. King described it?
I think, as Sylvia said, it's very similar and keeping in line with that. One of the things that Dr. Whitaker mentioned is that, we've seen a lot in terms of legal advances for gender and racial equality over the years and since Dr. King spoke. But what I would really like to see is that to translate more into the minds and hearts of people on an individual basis and on a more on-the-ground level. Because even though we have had all these great strides, especially legally and economically, socially, there's still a lot of, sexism and racism and prejudice. So I would like to see some of that eradicated on a more personal level.
Neither of you was alive 50 years ago when Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. But I'd like to know, Ms. Whitley, how does that historical time reflect on today's time in your own life and what you see in society?
I believe it's reflected in my life in numerous ways. For example, being able to attend a university and higher education, I don't feel that would have been I don't believe that's something that I would have been able to do 50 years ago. And as far as just being able to hold a job as a woman. So I do think that we have progressed from the day that he gave that speech, although I do think that there's a lot more progression that needs to take place. As far as with our job employment, it's the same as it was for blacks as it was 50 years ago, which was double that of whites. And as far as black children, 74% of them still attend segregated schools. So we have progressed, but I do think that we have more progression to take place.
And Ms. Hardy, same question. How do you see reflected today in your own life and in society progress from 50 years ago?
I think the issues that Dr. King spoke about are still very much relevant. For me personally, as a first-generation college student, I've experienced the economic struggle, and I think that, poor and working-class people in this country, the gap is growing wider and wider each day between the poor and the super rich. And then, as Sylvia said, there are a lot of issues today that we're still dealing with, despite the progress that has been made, in light of a lot of the recent attention to police violence, with the Trayvon Martin case and with Fruitvale Station coming out and profiling the life of Oscar Grant. Statistics are coming out that every 28 hours, a black man is killed by police or some sort of, judicial figure.
Does a message as resonant as Dr. King's I Have a Dream message fade with time? Is there a worry that younger generations, perhaps even younger than the two of you, will lose sight of what that's about, Ms. Whitley?
I do believe that people have begun to lose sight of that dream. People tend to think that we've already achieved it, racism is dead, everything's fine, and that's just not true. You can go walk down the street in not so nice neighborhood and racial names will be called out. Racism is not dead. We do have more to do. So I think that people think that everything is okay now, so they kind of revert back to their own personal lives. They're not working as a country to try and come together and to complete the dream that Dr. King envisioned for us.
And Ms. Hardy, your thoughts about that, especially in relation to what you study, gender equity?
I think that that's definitely a concern with regard to both gender, race, class, sexuality, and all forms of social difference. You know, we have this very pervasive myth that we live in a post-racial America. And I think that that extends into gender politics and sexual politics as well, where people feel like women do have equal opportunities to men, blacks do have equal opportunities with whites. And from the statistics and the different inequalities, we can see that that's just not true. But that idealism is very pervasive, particularly in the aftermath of the election of Obama. And I see it in the courses that I teach. I teach undergraduate courses in women's studies at ASU. And, you know, we have students coming in that have no knowledge of the civil rights movement, that don't know what the I Have a Dream speech is, or haven't heard of Malcolm X or other civil rights leaders. So I think that it's something that isn't resonating as much with younger generations because there's this pervasive idea that we've already achieved what we've set out to do.
Ms. Whitley, how do we get that younger generation, people even younger than you, to know about these things and to appreciate them for the changes they were and continue to be?
What we need to do is we need to conduct dialogues. We need to be talking about race. This needs to be on everybody's mind, and we need to discuss it because in doing so, we can realize that we do have more commonalities in between people that we may not have noticed before. We also can recognize differences and appreciate them for those differences. Doing all this dialogue about race, it's going to bridge the opportunity gaps in between people and allow us to truly be a country that is equal.
There's more on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, including a link to the text of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech on our website at azpm.org. That's our program for Friday, August 23rd, 2013. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Chihak.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.